Okay, so we have already broached the topic of divine command theory, and this week we're going to take a closer look at this particular version of theistic ethics. Divine command theory, which I'll often refer to simply as DCT, at least the version that we'll be discussing, says that God's commands either constitute moral obligations or cause them. So one model is a constitutive model, the other is a causal model. But we need not sweat that distinction for now. For present purposes, we can just go with the constitutive model and define divine command theory as equating or identifying God's commands with moral obligations. Before proceeding, allow me to reiterate an important point. I've said it before, but it's important to stress again that one need not be a divine command theorist in order to be a moral apologist. You don't have to be a divine command theorist to be a moral apologist. You can be, but you don't have to be. You might prefer a divine will theory, or a natural law approach, or a divine desire theory, or divine motivation account, or yet other possibilities, and still be a moral apologist. Theistic ethicists of various stripes can agree on the moral argument for God's existence without having to agree on the fine-grained details of their particular theistic ethical theories. All that it takes to be a moral apologist is thinking that you have principled reasons to consider some central features of morality as essentially dependent upon God in one way or another. As long as you have that essential dependence relation, you can feel free to promulgate the moral argument. Why, though, might some people prefer divine command theory? Well, recall what Evans refers to as the Anscombe intuition, that moral duties have a distinctive set of features. For example, they bring closure to deliberation. They make us liable to a kind of claim that someone has on me that's verdict-like in character, and so on. Following Robert Adams's social requirement model, Evans thinks that the special relationship between God and mankind makes divine commands the best source of moral obligations. So what's very important for us to do at this juncture is to be very attentive to the sorts of features and qualities that moral obligations have. This careful, close attentiveness to evidence is one of the most important features that we need to cultivate as moral apologists. So consider such features of moral obligations as these. Number one, moral obligations are objective. Two, moral obligations provide compelling reasons of a distinctive kind for actions. Number three, moral obligations should motivate us to comply. And four, moral obligations are universal, at least in a couple of ways. For example, all humans are subject to the claims of morality. And secondly, some moral obligations extend to all human persons. Bearing those in mind, consider these strengths of divine command theory as an account of moral obligations. According to divine command theory, for example, number one, moral obligations can be objective in relation to human beliefs and emotions, since there will be a fact of the matter about whether God has given some particular command, as well as about the content of the command. Two, we can understand why moral reasons are overriding in character, coming as they do from an authoritative source like God. Three, we can explain the motivating power of moral obligations. We should be motivated by our gratitude to God, if nothing else, to do as he commands. And four, we can understand why moral obligations are universal in both senses identified above. Evans points out two additional features of divine command theory that are important for us to bear in mind. One he calls the modal status thesis. This is the idea that in virtue of God issuing a command to do some action, call it X, X takes on a more robust normative status. It has some new moral quality in virtue of God having commanded it. 2, the discretion thesis. This is the idea that at least some of God's commands may well have been different. Maybe God would have told us to give 20% of our income instead of 10%. Or SCOTUS, for example, distinguished the first 5 of the 10 commandments from the second 5, arguing that the first set was necessary and the second set contingent. They could have been different. And opinions vary on the discretion hypothesis or thesis. Some people adopt it and some are more inclined to reject it. An important epistemic question that arises concerning divine command theory is, how is it that we know what God commands? Now you might think, well, the Bible tells us, and we can definitely start there with special revelation. Scripture does in fact clue us in, but there are other ways in which God may well command us and communicate his commands to us via, say, conscience or the moral teaching of our society or culture or subculture, reason, general revelation, and there are other possibilities besides. So we're not necessarily locked in to knowing God's commands via only one route. In addition to the reasons to take divine command seriously and various rationales for believing it as possibly true, there are also objections that various folks have raised, and I simply want to point you to these without necessarily reiterating all of their content, since that's already been laid out for you in the reading that you've done. So from Evans, there are 7 objections that are mentioned and discussed at length, and it's important that you understand what all of these objections are about. And those 7 objections: the Euthyphro problem, the horrible acts objection, the autonomy objection, the prior obligations objection, the supervenience objection, the mysterious relationship objection, and what he calls the promulgation objection. So be sure to read that chapter of Evans very closely and very carefully. There's also a corresponding, partially overlapping list of objections to divine command theory that you can find in Jerry's and my book, Good God. So I want you to understand these 2, as we call them: the normativity objection, the no reasons objection, the abhorrent command objection, the vacuity objection, the epistemic objection, and the autonomy objection. Again, very important that you familiarize yourself well with both sets of objections, what the objections are, and what the potential responses to them are as well. And when responding to different objections to theistic ethics generally, or divine command theory in particular, there are 7 useful distinctions that we identified in Good God that I'd like you to understand. Be sure that you review these carefully, understand their import, and see clearly how it is that they can be brought to bear in a discussion of the objections to divine command theory. We also make mention of this list in Morals of the Story, so we explain them in a few different places, but the 7 distinctions are definition versus analysis, univocation versus equivocation, conceivability versus possibility, good versus right, difficulty versus impossibility, knowing versus being, and dependence versus control.